The Hour of the Bull. Di Fiu Shu, the earth was born in the hour of the bull, otherwise of the demon, 2 in the morning. Old Chinese-Russian Dictionary of Bishop and Akinti. Beijing, 1909. Prologue. At the third cycle school, the final year of study had begun. At its end, students, under the guidance of already chosen mentors, were to set about performing the feats of Hercules. Readying themselves for independent life, the young men and women with special interest traversed the conspectus of history of humanity on Earth. Considered to be of chief importance was the study of ideative errors and the misdirectionality of social organization at those stages of development of society, where science made it possible to govern the fate of peoples and countries of the world, at first to only a small degree and later completely. The history of the people of Earth had been compared with the multitude of other civilizations on the distant worlds of the Great Circle. Blue frames topped with opalescent glass stood open. From behind them came the distant sound of crashing waves and the rustling of the wind in the foliage, the eternal music of nature, tuning to calm contemplation. Silence in the class, clear, pensive eyes. The teacher had just completed his lecture. Soundlessly, the curtains lowered, and, at the press of a button, the projector disappeared beneath his chair and out of sight. He settled into his seat, admiring the focused faces. To all appearances, the lecture was a success, however difficult and intricate a task it had been to reconcile the small and the great, the mighty ascension of humanity, and the abyss of grief of past times, the heart-stirring, short-lived pleasures of the individual with the terrible ruins of the state. The teacher knew. After the silence, there would follow questions. The more inquisitive, the stronger the painted by him historical picture would have touched the youngsters. And, in anticipation, he tried to guess what had most interested the students today and what might remain not understood. Perhaps the psychology of people in difficult eras of transition from lower social forms to higher, when faith in the nobility and honesty of man in his bright future was corroded by an agglomeration of lies, senseless cruelty, and fear. Doubts disarmed fighters for the transformation of the world, or made people indifferent to everything, shiftless cynics. How to understand the monstrous mass psychosis at the end of the EDW, the era of the divided world, leading to the destruction of culture and the beating down of the best. The youth of the EMH era of Methans were immeasurably far from everything connected with the hysterically strained nervousness and fears of past times. The teacher's thoughts were interrupted when a boy and a girl, similar in widely opened eyes, lending them both a look of surprise, simultaneously stood up from behind desks in different rows. The two exchanged glances, and the young man raised his hand, palm up, the gesture of a question. Would it be correct to say that all historical experience asserts the inevitable victory of higher forms over lower forms, both in the development of nature and in change? Asked the boy. Correct, Lark, if excluding special convergences of circumstance, which, like all that goes beyond the boundaries of the great dialectical process of averaging, are very rare, answered the teacher. For example, the case with Zerda, whose dead ruins are overgrown with black poppies, asked Puna, drawing herself out in all her short stature. Or other, later discovered planets, added the teacher, where there is everything for life. Blue domes of mighty atmosphere, transparent seas, clean rivers, and warm sunlight. But the winds blow the dead sands, and their noise, along with the noise of the sea or thunder, are the lone sounds, disturbing the silence of vast deserts. Thinking life in wild delusion, killed itself and all living things, having barely brushed the surface of the power of the atom and of the cosmos. But we already populated them? Oh yes. But what significance does this have for those whose traces were scattered by dust millions of years ago, having preserved nothing, so that we could understand how and why they destroyed themselves and all life on their planets? Into the aisle between the desks slipped Iota, stoic and fiery, similar, in the common opinion of the class, to the ancient girls of South Asia, who wore sharp daggers in their hair or behind their belts, and boldly used them for the defense of their honor. I have just read about the dead civilizations in our own galaxy, she said with a low voice. Not killed, not self-destroyed, but namely, dead. If the legacy of their thoughts and deeds are preserved, then this is a dangerous poison that could infect an as yet immature society, blindly perceiving semblant wisdom. Sometimes, though, the experience of millions of years of struggle for liberation from the bonds of nature is precious. The study of deceased civilizations is as dangerous as the dismantling of ancient depositories of weapons, stumbled upon from time to time on our planet. I would like to dedicate my life to such research, the girl added quietly. It seems we are deviating from where Lark began, said the teacher. Puna asked inaccurately. A stocky black-haired boy rose. He looked back at his comrades, most of whom had raised their hands, almost jumping out of impatience. Should it be understood that the development of society that has begun is definitely either a transition to higher, communistic forms or universal destruction? And nothing different? He went on. Incorrectly worded, Kimmy, the teacher retorted. Ye cannot equate the process of development to two scales. Among those known to us of the civilizations of the Ring, there are known cases of swift and easy transitions to higher, communistic society. We have just spoken about the self-destruction of a fragmented world that reached great scientific and technical heights. There were periods of long turmoil, murderous wars that flung the humanity of some planets back into poverty and savagery. A new ascendancy began, a new war, and so on until the productive forces of the planet were exhausted and technically degraded. Descendants had to correct this degradation for centuries, despite the infinite might of higher social forms and the help of the mind-reason of the Great Circle. But also here, the advent of this form of communistic society was inevitable? Naturally. Then I incorrectly posed the question, said Kimmy after a moment's thought. Are there any known cases where humanity on any other planet reached high levels of science, techniques, and productive forces, but also did not become communistic and did not perish from the terrible forces of premature cognition? Are there many such exceptions to the general law of development, which, if it is general, should have them? The teacher thought for a minute, lowering his eyes onto the translucent green console of the lecturing desk, from under which, during the lecture, the necessary data and certificates were dug up. The remarkable story of the planet Tormans was a sensation in the memory of the older generation. Of course, the young students knew about it too. Many books, films, songs, and poems brought to life the epic of the starship, Dark Flame. Her 13 heroes were immortalized by a grouping of lambent reddish stones on a small plateau, Ravat, on that very place from where the starship set out on her journey. The lecture hall silently waited. The students of the older classes were sufficiently trained in endurance and self-mastery. Without the cultivation of these necessary qualities, a person could not proceed to undertake the feats of Hercules, let alone fulfill them. Ye had in your view the planet Tormans? The teacher finally spoke. We know only it. The students answered in chorus. And how many others have there been, others like it? I cannot say without detailed research. The teacher could not help but smile slightly. I am an historian of Earth and know the civilizations of different planets only in broad outline. Need I remind ye that uncovering the most complex processes of the history of other worlds requires a very deep insight into the essence of alien to us economics and social psychology. Even in order to understand whether a civilization is good or bad, it brings either joy or sorrow, bloom or death. Responded a boy sitting near the window who stood out among the others in his seriousness. Even for that, Moran, confirmed the teacher. Otherwise, we will differ in nothing from our ancestors, quick to action and immature in judgment. I have told ye about the planets destroyed by unreason, but there were also other worlds where no one killed anyone, but where reasoning life nonetheless ended in what in the old days was called the natural way. The thinking species of life on these planets died out, just as all replacing one another animal species inevitably die out, and man too, if he neglects the cognition of biological phenomena in their historical development. These planets, ordered and beautiful, were passed on by their dying inhabitants to others, for whom the totality of the natural conditions was most suitable. All the data was transmitted along the Great Circle, and settlement took place after the last representatives of the dying civilization had passed away, and the signal of their death swept along the circle. Like the Knights of Happiness, said the shy Kunti, but we really don't know so much even about Tormans. Of course, we've all read about it, but now when we study our own history, we will understand Tormans more correctly. Moreover, the planet is inhabited by our very own people, descendants of Earthlings, and all processes of its development are analogous to our own, agreed the teacher. That is a good idea. I will request from the House of History a starlet, a memory machine with the full story of the expedition to Tormans. To view it will take preparation. Arrange with the Distribution Bureau for exemption from other lectures. Let one of you, passionate about cosmophysics, perhaps Kimmy, prepare for tomorrow an abstract on the first direct beam starships, so that you can understand the situation and the labors of the crew of the Dark Flame. After that, we set out for the Revet Plateau to the memorial raised in honor of the expedition. Then, the Starlet will give you a full understanding of all that took place. 2 days later, the final class of SPCS 401 school was merrily seated under the transparent dome of a gigantic carriage on Spiral Road. The train had barely begun to pick up speed when out of the central aisle, Kimmy appeared, announcing that he was ready to read his abstract. Energetic protests were heard. The students contended that there would not be enough attention. It was too interesting to look around. The teacher reconciled everyone, suggesting that they listen to the abstract during the middle leg of the journey when the train would cross a fruit belt with a width of close to 400 kilometers, 2 hours of travel. When the endless, geometrically regular rows of trees stretched out on the site of the former desert steppe of Deccan, Kimmy set up a small projector in the aisle and sent colored rays of illustration onto the interior wall. The young man spoke about the discovery of the spiral structure of the universe, after which they had been able to solve the problem of ultra-distant, interstellar travel. About the bipolar structure of the world, mathematicians knew already in the EDW, but physicists of that time, by their naive view of antimatter, muddled the question. "Just think," exclaimed Kimmy. They believed that a change in the surface charge of a particle changes all the properties of matter and turns all the normal substance of our world into antimatter, the collision with which should supposedly cause the complete annihilation of matter. They peered into the blackness of the night sky, not knowing how to explain it, not understanding that the true anti-world is right here, nearby, black, impenetrable, imperceptible for instruments tuned to the manifestations of our bright world. "Don't get worked up, Kimmy," the teacher stopped the youth. "You make a mistake, judging poorly about the ancestors." Towards the end of the EDW, in the era of the withering away of the old principles of social life, science became the leading force in society. Then similar narrow and, I would say, unfair judgments about predecessors were widespread. Is it so difficult to understand that the wrong or inaccurate aspect of the phenomenon will be a mistake only as a result of unconscientious or foolishly oriented research? All the remaining mistakes of the predecessors depend on the general level at which science was in their time. Try to imagine for a moment that, discovering hundreds of elementary particles in the microworld, they had no idea that these are just different aspects of motion at different levels of the anisotropic structure of space and time. "Really?" Kimmy reddened to the ears. The teacher nodded, and the abashed boy continued, but already with less verve. "The anti-world, the black world, was called by scientist Tormans after the ocean of inactive energy in ancient Indian philosophy. It is in all respects polar to our world, and therefore absolutely imperceptible by our senses. Only recently, with special instruments, as if inverted, in relation to instruments of our world, conditionally called the Shakti world, did they begin to grasp the outer contours of Tormans. We don't know whether Tormans has formations of stars and planets analogous to our own, although, according to the laws of dialectical philosophy, the motion of matter should also exist there." "Hard to imagine, but how interesting it sounds. The invisible son of Tormans," exclaimed Rare. "And an invisible planet populated by beings who, like us, are trying to penetrate the abyss of our world," the voice of Iverta rang out from the back row. "And whole stellar systems, galaxies with minus gravity, negative field properties there, where with us they are positive, dead motionlessness, where with us there is motion. And everything is totally the other way around," Iota continued, leaning on the soft ledge of the side window. "By the way, about galaxies. Their classic spiral forms were known already to the first inventors of telescopes," continued Kimmy. "But it took several centuries to understand in them the real reflection of the structure of the universe, fibers, or rather strata, of our world interlayered with Tormans and together with it coiled into an endless spiral. And individual elements, from galaxies to atoms, at each step with their own special qualities of pan-universal laws. It turned out that light and other radiations never propagate in the universe in a straight line, but wind on a spiral, simultaneously sliding along a helicoid, unfurling more and more as the distance from the observer increases. We got an explanation for the compression and extension of light waves, with their shortening to the measure of ingression deeper into the spiral, and the apparent scattering of stars and galaxies in distant volutions. We solved the Lorentzian equation with its apparent disappearance of time and increase in mass at the speed of light. One more step, and zero space was understood as the boundary between worlds and anti-worlds, between Shakti and Tamas, where the polar points of space, time, and energy are mutually balanced and neutralized. Zero space is also twisted into a spiral corresponding to both worlds, but the youth faltered. I haven't yet been able to figure out how it is possible to move within it, almost instantaneously reaching any point in our universe. It was approximately explained to me that the starship of the direct beam does not go along the spiral course of light, but as if across it, along the longitudinal axis of the snail, using the anisotropy of space. In addition, the starship in relation to time as if stands still, while the entire spiral of the world rotates around it. Kimmy, reddening, helplessly shook his head under the laughter of his comrades. In vain do ye thank Kimmy so, the teacher raised his hand discontentedly. In the new picture of the universe, there is still much that is accessible only to the mathematical feeling out of separate phenomena. Ye have forgotten that science moves in the darkness of the unknown depths of the world, like a blind man with outstretched hands, perceiving obscure contours. And only after tremendous labor are research apparatuses created that are able to illuminate the unknown and adjoin it to the known. The teacher looked over the quietened students and finished. There is something that Kimmy has not yet said, something important. Long ago, the areas of negative gravity in the cosmos were guessed, but only 3 centuries ago did they receive their explanation as collapses from our world into Tamas or into zero space. It has happened that starships of other civilizations, not adapted for movement in zero space, have at times disappeared in them without a trace. The direct beam starship falls under an even greater danger. At the slightest error in balancing the fields, it risks slipping either into our Shakti space or into the space of Tamas. From Tamas, return is impossible. We simply do not know what goes on there with our objects. Whether instant annihilation takes place or all active processes also freeze instantly, turning, for example, a starship into a block of absolutely dead substance. This new concept of substance also came about as a consequence of the discovery of Tamas. Now you can imagine for yourselves the danger to which the first DBS's direct beam starships, and among them the Dark Flame, were exposed. But people went for this monstrous risk. The possibility to instantaneously penetrate the desired point in space was worth any risk. And after all, entirely recently, mastering the infinity of the cosmos had seemed an absolute impossibility. There were no visible paths towards the resolution of this curse of all times and civilizations of the cosmos, united in the Great Circle, but seeing each other only on the screens of the outer stations. 300 years have passed since mankind entered the EMH, a new era. The bold dream of people came true, and distant worlds, in terms of time, are as close to us as outstretched hands. Of course, in practice, the movement of the DBS is not instantaneous. It takes time to remove to zero space, time for the very complex calculation of the exit point and pulling the starship from an approximate point to the target on ordinary animeson motors and at sublight speed. But what is 2 or 3 months of this work compared with millions of light years of distance of the usual spiral light path in our space? Even the gain in speed from a tortoise to an ordinary starship is nothing compared to the DBS. As if illustrating the words of the teacher, the train plunged into a long tunnel. An opal light ignited in the carriage, emphasizing the impenetrable darkness outside the windows. Suddenly, a flash, as an immense plain overgrown with silver grass lay itself open. Whirlwinds, lifted by the blistering run of the carriages, swirled widely, scattering to the sides. A bright cyan stripe in the distance marked ancient stepped mountains, among which, in the direction of the Indian Ocean, was Ravat Plateau. It was close to the station, and reaching it required nothing of the young travelers other than their own legs, sufficiently trained in walking and running. The distant shore could be guessed only by the shades of the sky and the descending towards the horizon sun. Grass whipped across the bare legs of the travelers, causing a burning itch. The wind shrouded their backs in a dry heat. Rising air currents surrounded an annular ridge of flat hills and a shimmering wall. Having scaled the crossing point, the youngsters froze. An unexpected grove of huge sequoias hid the center of the plateau. 34 wide paths, by the number of the major vectors of the Great Circle, ran out from the grove, spreading to the slopes of the surrounding hills of brown basalt, sheerly cut and covered with some bas-reliefs. The students did not begin to examine them, rushing along the white stone of the main path towards the grove. Only 2 round columns of black granite marked the entrance. Under the branches of redwoods stretched to a colossal height, the blinding sun faded and the rustle of the wind hushed. The austere might of the tall trunks compelled the students to temper steps into lower voices, as though they had broken through into a refuge of mystery, remote from all the world. They exchanged glances with excitement and curiosity, anticipating something extraordinary. But when they entered the central clearing into the prior unrelenting brightness of the sky, the monument to the starship, Dark Flame, came across to them as too simple. The model of the ship, a hemispherical dome of dark green metal, was dissected with a rough, straight cleft, as if cleaved asunder by a colossal sword. Around the base, under the annular ledge, sculptures of people were arranged. The platform, the foot of the monument, consisted of a tightly twisted spiral of light, merely polished metal, embedded in a matte black stone. The number of sculptures in each semicircle of the cut turned out to be dissimilar, 5 in the west, 8 in the east. The students quickly unriddled the not complex symbolism. This is the death, dividing those who perished on the planet Tormans from those who returned to Earth, Iota said quietly, paling slightly from the feelings that had grasped her. The teacher silently inclined his head. And those who returned? The returnees did not live long, due to the overstrain of the path and terrible tribulations. At that moment, Lark, who had drawn near to the western semicircle of sculptures, raised in front of himself crossed palms, the gesture of a call to silence. The others approached slowly. The teacher remained behind, regarding the dome of the starship, surging up from the long shadow of the grove and resembling a gleaming dark mirror. Next to the cut, somewhat distant from the others, stood a woman in a calm, taut pose, book in her hands. The light folds of her suit with a short skirt hugged her body. Only the thick signal bracelet of an astronaut above the elbow of her left arm gave away her connection with the super-distant cosmic expedition. She was looking over the top of the book, large locks of thick hair falling down over her forehead, frowning in thought. The same intense thought was reflected in the mournful bend of full lips and lines around the eyes. Phyrotis herself, the commander of the expedition, whispered Puna, the first to approach the statues. In the silence of the monument, the noise of footsteps on the smooth metal seemed offensively loud, and the youngsters kicked off their shoes. Another woman stood sideways, left shoulder thrust forward, hand buried in a lush mane of hair with a gesture of perhaps aversion, perhaps alarm. Her face, perfectly oval, with clearly Mongolian features, was drawn to the audience. In the slanting eyes lurked the strongest nervous tension. It seemed that Tevisa Henako, the expedition biologist, was about to shout, "Look how bad it is." And in contrast to the disquiet of the biologist, next to her, the astrophysicist of the starship, Tor Leek, leaned freely and calmly against the hatch frame, right hand laid on the shoulder of Tevisa in a gesture of reassurance and protection. He stood with his legs crossed lightsomely, and from his whole figure emanated not physical, for this he was too young and thin, but nervous power. Turned away from the astrophysicist, his large head bowed, First Astronavigator Viranorin's right hand was extended in front of the chest of the last of the 5 Armor Defense Engineer General Atal. The engineer carried both hands high, holding the hilt of some primitive weapon. His long face with narrow, closely set eyes was thunderous. Gen Atal appeared before the memory of the Earth as a warrior in the throes of battle with a fierce enemy. The statues of those who forever remained on the immeasurably distant planet and who gave their lives to the unknown people of Tormans were dramatically emblazoned by the rays of the setting sun breaking through the crowns of the sequoias. The sculptures of the 8 returnees found themselves in the twilight shadow, as if veiled in a cover of mourning. Almost on the line of the cut, very close to the 5 dead, but somehow apart from all the others, stood 2 women, tightly embracing. One was in full bloom of strength, dressed in a thin, close-fitting blouse with bare shoulders and ordinary astronaut trousers. She squinted from beneath her lowered eyelashes. A bitter smile touched her small upper lip. Clinging to her was a short girl in the full suit of a star pilot, That is, a light jacket with a standing collar and loose trousers. She was tensed in a half-turn, as if bridling erupting feelings, and, leaning her thigh against a part of some device, looked on the audience with anger, grief, and an emotion rarely found on Earth. Pity, and a stubborn, willful effort, clenching a large, firmly outlined mouth. Doctor of the Starfleet, Iviza Tannant, and anthropologist-linguist Chitty Don. The students read on the pedestal, moving slowly on to the next sculpture. The commander and most responsible specialist of the ship, engineer of Annihilation Unit's Griffrift, was depicted in the pilot's seat, hands resting on the conditionally designated console. His highbrow face, full of stern determination, lined with creases of deep thought and will, he turned from the instruments to the other statues, as if he were suddenly about to say something very important to his comrades. And not only important, bad news was clearly expressed by the artist in the face of the engineer. Nearby, also seated in an armchair, armed with astronaut's bracelet outstretched, pilot engineer Div Symbol was leaning forward, not taking his eyes off Griffrift. He was sculpted in profile, side to the viewer. The massive head with tightly clenched jaws, in juxtaposition with the other, very living sculptures, seemed rock-like and unmoving on a bowed, mighty neck. The right hand gripped the handle of a device. Div Symbol was waiting for a signal. 3 woman statues at the end of the semicircle conveyed a completely different mood. Second astronavigator Mentakor sat, snugly curled up, legs tucked under her, in the corner of what looked like a deep sofa. Her eyes, wide open beneath low eyebrows, were fixed on the distance above the band of the computing machine. She held the band with both hands almost right up to the lips of her mouth, half open in thought. Exquisite workmanship was able to express triumphant confidence. Obviously, the astronavigator had managed to resolve something very complex. Naya Holly, biosecurity engineer just as young as Chetty Don, crouched at the edge of the ledge, leaning forward and resting her folded arms on short levers. Having sharply turned her head to the left, she looked as if at a suddenly appeared enemy. Steely courage was expressed in all her lithe figure, dressed in a blouse with rolled-up sleeves, unbuttoned at the chest. The legs, bare along the entire length, were crossed in a clear effort, and the left, thrown above the right, rested on a pedal. Careless locks of hair fell over the right shoulder, cheek, and partially covered the forehead. "I like her best of all," whispered Lark to a friend, a girl standing next to him. She said nothing, shaking her head in the negative, and pointed to the third star pilot. Almost naked, with a defiant consciousness of the special strength of her body, she straightened out, chest held high, hands clasped at an incredibly thin waist, and eyes lowered. An old-fashioned short hairstyle framed her face, which tapered to a pointed chin. An omniscient, unaffectionate smile played on her lips, revealing dimples in the corners of the mouth. One shoulder was covered with thin folds of a scarf carved from black stone, thrown from under her arm behind her back. Perhaps the sculptor was in love with this image. In any case, Oladez, the engineer of communications and filming, was embodied in a strikingly animate statue full of feeling and womanliness. But Solsane, the last member of the starship crew, placed behind Ola at the end of the semicircle, was not looking at her. Leaning out from behind the control panel of the machine, the eyes of the computing engineer were narrowed in a gentle grin that furrowed his slender face with mischievous wrinkles. It seemed he was trying to look over to the other side of the monument, where his closest and most beloved stood, now forever hidden from him. The sun finally set, the lights went out in the dome, and the tropical night crept up suddenly. But right then, in obedience to the presence of visitors, lamps of orange light, hidden in the annular visor above the statues, automatically ignited. In the skillfully crossed rays, the statues were brought even more to life, while everything around disappeared in impenetrable darkness. The students were unbreathing. It was just as if they had been left alone with the heroes of the dark flame. A few minutes of waiting, and the star pilots would surely draw breath, smile, and stretch out their hands to their descendants. But time passed, and the frozen motionlessness of the figures weighed ever heavier. Perhaps for the first time, a sense of the inevitability of death, irreparable loss, penetrated deep into the minds of the young ones. Someone sighed loudly. Kimmy rubbed his temples, resolutely stepped towards the statue of Phyrotis, and bowed before her with a gesture of farewell, almost stumbling over the corner of the stone book she was holding in front of her. His comrades dispersed, pausing in reflection in front of their favorite sculptures. Others, stepping further away, examined the sculptural group as a whole. Most of the students lingered in front of the Western group. These people never returned to dear Earth, never again touched her healing nature, did not see, in their dying hours, a single person of their birth planet. The world of Tormans, located at a distance inaccessible to anything other than the DBS, seemed even more hopeless, more dangerous and depressing than the dead planets found round the nearby suns, or the worlds of incomprehensible life on the screens of the Great Circle. The young people were imbued with the mood of those times when the departure of the first DBS was akin to a dive into an unfathomable abyss. They forgot about the fact that the sacrifice of Earth on Tormans had not been in vain, and stood in front of the monument, as those who more than a century ago had seen off the dark flame on her, as yet traveled by no one path, full of an indescribable anxiety and a very real consciousness of the great peril of the expedition. The teacher had achieved his objective. The students were ready for the viewing of the Starlet of the House of History, a stereo film with a description of the expedition, for the most part filmed on location. Other events were reconstructed according to recordings of memory devices and the stories of returned members of the expedition. The youngsters had to be reminded of the need to return. Several suggested that they spend the night where they were, but most accepted the advice of the teacher, to return by night train to watch the Starlet tomorrow, which would require a whole day with a break for rest. Reluctantly, often looking back, the students gathered and walked along the road through the grove. As soon as the last one had descended from the platform of the base, the lighting of the monument extinguished. The model of the starship and the statues of its team disappeared into the darkness, as if they had fallen into the black abyss of the anti-world of Tomas. The edges of the road lit up with a faint phosphoric glow. The travelers could confidently walk both in the impregnable darkness of the grove and under the starry sky through the pass of the circle of hills. In concentrated silence they came to the station. The familiar atmosphere of the spiral road, light, and the presence of many people diminished the impression, and the youngsters proceeded to excitedly discuss what they had seen. The question, "Who did you like best?" was heatedly debated until the train arrived and the tired travelers reclined on the soft seats. "But just the same, the 5 that died are better than the returners, and this is no accident," asserted Kimmy, arranging himself more comfortably. "Not at all," objected the curled-up Puna. "To me, Griff Rift seemed the deepest, firmest, and most intelligent. Why did he stay on the ship then? Who, apart from him, could have handled annihilation? Have you really not understood that the dark flame would then have perished on Tormans, or along the way, and we would never have learned anything? This is true, and yet, I want to sleep and not argue with you." Moreover, everyone reacted differently to the people of the expedition. Dalvi was delighted with the fighting General Atal and Nea Holly, and you did not take your eyes off Phyrotis and Div Symbol. "We'll see who is better," came objections from the other row of seats. "Tomorrow, after the Starlet." "We'll see," Puna muttered sleepily, but the restless Kimmy approached the teacher who had settled in the back end of the cabin. The young man gestured for permission and received an affirmative tilt of the head. "Teacher, with your experience of life and in-depth understanding," said Kimmy, "which of them would you choose as your friend? Do you think of comrades in exploits or of a mentor?" Kimmy reddened and lowered his eyes. "I understand. But the choosing of a girlfriend cannot be imitational, and I am not an example to you." "No, of course. But I wanted to know, thinking about the fidelity of judgment and taste. We are all so divided. And good. We, teachers, try to cultivate independence of judgment in ye from the first steps in life. Then, after a certain amount of knowledge, there arises a commonality of understanding. And ye? I, if I could choose, would choose Phyrotis." "Oh really? I also, or Oladez. Why though?" the youth exclaimed perplexedly. "They are so different, completely dissimilar." "That is the point. See, I warned you. It's time to sleep, and we won't begin a complex conversation. But soon you will have to learn, not by reason, but by feeling, the inevitable polarity of sensations, the dialectics of life, far and away more complex and difficult than all the puzzling tasks of the creators of theories in science and new paths of art. Always remember that the most difficult thing in life, this is man himself, because he came out of the wild, not destined for a life led by the power of thoughts and nobility of feelings, the life he is meant to lead." The teacher fell silent, and gently nudged Kimmy towards his place. These final words echoed many times in the memory of the young man in those hours when the starlet of the memory machine began to unfold the narrative of the planet Tormans in the almost real life of the TVF screens.